Dear God, almighty and everlasting, we believe that you have made all things and love everything that you have made. Therefore, every one of us are embraced by your tender concern. May we rest in the knowledge that we exist because you want us to be, and that even at this very moment you have intended for us to survive. May we find comfort in the fact that you are the Lord of our past, the Lord of our present, and the Lord of our future. You know who we were, who we are, and who we have the potential to be. Your love has never failed us or abandoned us. Therefore, help us this night to gently open our sails into the winds of your Spirit, to trust you with whatever it is that we have brought into this place, and to give ourselves into your desire for us to grow with glad and open hearts. We lift our sails. We invite the winds of your Spirit. We thank you that we're alive. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Tonight is the fourth of our fall studies. Our focus is that relatively small passage of Scripture known as the Beatitudes. It is the introduction, the first part of the Sermon on the Mount in the 5th chapter of Matthew. I have given these 8 qualities that you find in the Beatitudes. I've given them the overall theme of Jesus' secret of happiness. My contention is going to be throughout this study that here are the capacities that Jesus identifies as ingredients of authentic well-being. Here is the road each of us humans is invited to travel if we're going to come into that profound sense of happiness or joy or satisfaction that I think every one of us hunger for. These qualities of life are gifts that God gives. They're not requirements that we have to come up with on our own. And I've been making the point throughout the whole study that this, I believe, is a profoundly true interpretation of happiness. I really think you can trust these words of Jesus. But these words are surprising, and they conflict oftentimes with the things that we've thought up to now about what constitutes happiness. And therefore I've had to be inviting you from the start to keep an open mind, to allow this perhaps strange at first sounding philosophy, to allow this to take its shape and to commend itself. Don't come to closure too quickly about the possibilities that this might be a deeper insight into happiness than what you brought with you to this study. I've mentioned before that Father Henry Nouwen has really helped me to understand why the Old Testament puts such a tremendous emphasis on hospitality. Father Nouwen describes hospitality as creating that free and friendly space where the strangers can shed their strangeness and give us the gifts that they have acquired on their journey. He's pointed out that hospitality was the form of education in primitive culture. You realize that those people had no formal schools. Most of them never went over a few miles from where they were born. Their experience was very, very limited. And therefore the only chance they had to learn things that they had never known before came when somebody in a caravan from another place would come by, or a person who had courage enough to venture out on his own, her own, would come, and it was the willingness to make room for the stranger, to let the person who was not oneself come in and sit down and tell something of what that one had learned on their journeys. That was the way that people increased their fund of knowledge. That was the way that they experienced education. Well, now today we are not limited as they were by no schools and no travel. But I'd like to contend that the stance of hospitality, the creating the free and friendly space between you and the not yet experienced, that is still as foundational to growth as it was in the time of Abraham. The way to entertain angels unawares, that is, the way to find yourself blessed by what you didn't even know existed, is to have a stance of openness to what you have not yet experienced. So I'm inviting us to realize that we're dealing in the Beatitudes with some things that may sound strange, but be hospitable to these seemingly unconventional notions at first, and give them time to unpack and to tell you what they have to tell you about their journey. I was in Washington some years ago, and I was with an older woman whose spiritual depth really impressed me very much. And one day, in a kind of offhand remark, she said to me, "If you will fast one day a week for a whole year, you'll be glad you did." That's all she said. She didn't make any more specific instructions. She didn't make any more definite promises. She just said, "If you'll do this for a year, you'll be glad." It was just that right combination of intrigue and promise that really did spur me to act. If she had threatened me and said, "Unless you fast, bad things are going to happen to you," or if she had overpromised and said, "If you fast, blank, blank, blank is going to take place," I might not have responded. But when she simply said, "If you'll do this, you'll be glad you did," it was a very compelling invitation. And so I did fast one day a week for a year, and I was exceedingly glad. Something I'd never experienced before really did come in on its own terms and bring me a depth of blessing. All I'm asking you to do is to simply stay hospitable to the Beatitudes. If you will live with these and let them live their way into you, I honestly think you'll be glad at the end of this study that you have had that kind of openness to what admittedly at first may seem very strange. Okay, we've talked in the two sessions just prior to this about the qualities of poverty of spirit, and the quality last week, "Blessed are those that mourn." We come today to the third of the Beatitudes, and here again we're going to run smack into what seems like on first hearing to be absolute contradiction, or not at all what we would expect if we were putting together a definition of happiness. Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." If you were hearing that for the first time and were perfectly honest, I'm guessing you would say under your breath, "You got to be kidding." Because as we think of meekness, that is, as that word exists in our culture, it is so much the equivalent of weakness. It is so much a looked down on and despised condition that to say that the quality of achieving meekness is at the heart of learning to be happy, it just absolutely clashes with all of our preconceptions. As a way of substantiating that, let me ask you a hypothetical question. Let me suggest that you're on the back of a crowded elevator, and two friends of yours get on the front, and you see them, but they don't see you. And the doors close, and you overhear them talking, and you suddenly realize they're talking about you, and one of them describes you as being meek. Would you take that as a compliment, or would you take that as an insult? Well, now my hunch is that you would take it as an insult. That person thinks that I am meek. Now the reason that we don't hear that said to our faces is because we do have negative connotations of this quality, and most of us in this room are Southerners, and we are complicits at indirection and not saying face to face what we really feel and think in our heart of hearts. I grew up in this kind of family system. My father's mother was a powerful Victorian matron, held a whole family system together. She grew up in southern Kentucky and had two friends with whom she had gone to school for years. They went away to boarding school. The three of them were very, very close to each other. Well, one of these friends became engaged to a young minister in the community. I need in pause to tell you here that the Claypool side of my background was not all that invested in the church. Now, my mother's side was major Baptist. They were deep water. They were into it all the way up over their heads. In fact, when I was ordained as a Southern Baptist clergyman, I was the 68th person in a larger family system that had been ordained to the Baptist ministry. When I got out to the Austin Seminary in 1985, I found out that in the eyes of the Anglican Church, I had only been a devout layman for all those years. But we called it ordination in the Baptist Church, and that side of my mother's house, that side of my family, were really deeply into the faith. And my father's family were, I don't mean that they were against the church, it just wasn't as obsessive with them as it was on my maternal side. And that was true of my grandmother. I mean, she was married to my grandfather, who was a medical doctor. She had come from kind of the landed gentry of those country communities. And when she heard that her friend was engaged to a minister, she really thought that this lady was making a tragic mistake. Frederick Buechner grew up in a family that didn't go to church at all, had no specific religious interest. And he had a profound religious experience when he was about 28 and decided out of that he would go to the seminary. And one of his grandmother's friends took him to lunch one day to the country club right after this had come out. And he said, at the discreet moment, she said, "I hear you're thinking about going to the seminary and going to the ministry." And he said, "That's right." She said, "Is this your idea or were you poorly advised?" This would have been my grandmother's feelings. Well, anyway, she's got this close friend who's engaged to a young minister and this other friend that knows them both. So she sits down one day and writes both of her friends a letter. She tells the third party exactly what she thinks about what is happening and what a tragic mistake Annie Laurie is making in marrying this person. And then she sends Annie Laurie, of course, just a flowery congratulations. And as luck would have it, she got the two letters mixed up, and how she really felt went to the person involved. And I heard her say later that it was a sign of the strength of that woman's friendship, that when she got the letter, she wrote her back and said, I got the letter you intended for Jane. And all I can say is that you don't know Mr. Ransom, and when you get to know him, you'll realize that you're mistaken, and their friendship managed to survive that. I wish that had taught my grandmother not to be indirect. It didn't. I mean, it went on for the rest of my life. But the point I'm trying to make is that most people, if they think you're meek, are not going to tell you, because that word in our particular parlance is not a compliment. It is not something that a person would swell with pride. Hearing said about them in all honesty, it would really be taken as a cutting insult. And there are just any number of images in our culture that we associate with meekness that I think simply underline the fact that this is not a quality that any of us have a tendency to admire. If you were to ask me what is an image of meekness in our contemporary usage, I would have to say that the old comic strip character Casper Milquetoast. Now, some of you are too young to remember, but he was a wimpy little fellow whose wife was about a head taller than he was, and she always seemed to be speaking louder than he. He was the kind of character that you didn't feel like could ever stand up for himself, much less stand up to her or to anybody else. He was more like a jellyfish. The substance of Milquetoast pretty well describes the kind of backbone that he lacked. And I saw a cartoon once that it had Mrs. Milquetoast saying, "Casper, are you a man or a mouse? Go ahead, squeak up." In other words, she had already decided what he was going to do. This wasn't a Casper Milquetoast cartoon, but it would be in the same vintage of meekness. I saw a cartoon in the New Yorker that had a man standing out by a crumpled fender of a car, and he's explaining to a policeman who's got out his book what happened in this accident. And the man said, "My wife was driving. I was at the wheel." Well, now, that would be the picture in our culture of a meek man. somebody who simply doesn't ever live out of his own strength. Another illustration, and this is going to date me even more, is I will be 58 in December. Back in about the late 30s, early 40s, I used to read comic books all the time, and on the back of the comic books there would often be an advertisement for the Charles Atlas bodybuilding procedure. And there would always be cartoons where this scrawny little guy would be out on a beach looking horrible in his bathing suit, and this big guy would come along and kick sand in his eyes and take his girl away and utterly humiliate him. And then he gets in touch with Charles Atlas, and he goes through all of this process, and so then he comes back and takes it out on the erstwhile bully. Okay, those cartoons are what to do about meekness, how to get rid of it, how to shed this image of weakness. And if you'll just think about the comparisons that we usually make, that somebody is meek as a mouse, a meek little person, meek as a lamb, lovable, harmless, but utterly weak and helpless care of animals. You get the contemporary connotation of what meekness is to us, and therefore no wonder when we hear this, we say, Jesus has got to be kidding. What does this kind of spinelessness have to do with the sturdy quality of happiness? Well, now, it seems like to me that the problem that we have here, and what we're going to have to get out of the way tonight if we're going to get on to really understanding, is to recognize that the difficulty here is a genuinely linguistic one. It has to do with something that is going on all the time, and that is that words, like children, never stay still. They are always moving. They have a life of their own. Everything in our human existence is caught up in this process of flux. And one of the reasons that we have to keep translating our scriptures, generation after generation, and one of the reasons we have to keep revising our prayer books, is because words have a way of changing meaning across the years. And words can mean one thing at one time, and through a shifting of usage, they can come to mean something very different. And tonight, if you're going to get in touch with what Jesus was really pointing to in suggesting that in the constellation of characteristics that make for happiness, he was not talking about the meekness, the weakness that I have just been identifying in our contemporary usage. In our own lives, in my own relatively brief memory, think of what's happened to the word gay. It used to be a word that would be a compliment. It used to be a word that you could, as a synonym for a glad and lighthearted person, it has become now narrowed down to one particular human condition, and it's in a way very sad to think of what has happened, but this is happening all the time to words. It has happened to the word meek. Father Henry and I went to the first of the Godfather movies and came out realizing that that same process had happened to two very old and grand words in the English language. It was the scene where Marlon Brando, who was playing the Godfather, growls out in that gravelly voice to one of his henchmen, "Go take care of Giuseppe," as these men went out to do their work of violence. Now, instead, it struck him that was a case where two old positive words had literally been stood on their head. There was a time when the instruction to go and take care of somebody would have meant that something very beneficent was going to happen. That's exactly what Jesus said from the cross. He calls John, his beloved disciple, he calls his mother together there at the foot, and he says, in effect, to both of them, take care of each other. And what he meant was, begin to take responsibility for each other's welfare, something utterly positive. It's the same thing that I heard last Friday night, and I went back to Jackson, Mississippi, where several years ago I served in a parish, and some friends that were very close to us, and their daughter was getting married, and because we had had ties all the way back to her junior high days, I agreed to help with her wedding. And at the rehearsal dinner, her father, who I know very well, and I know the deep affection that he's had for both of his daughters. He got up, and in making his toast to the groom, if you could have really broken it down and translated it to its most central message, it was, look, boy, take care of my little girl. In other words, he was really saying, man to man, this child really means a lot to me. I've poured much of my existence into it, and I want you to be as caring and loving for her as I have tried to be. I just simply pause, this is an aside, and say, being at that wedding rehearsal and being at the wedding the next day said to me quite eloquently why we need, at these great transition points in life, to gather lots of people together, because there's so many things going on in funerals and weddings and baptisms. You know, there's this great joy at a wedding because these two have found each other. They're beginning a new life, and yet there is also an undeniable dimension of a sadness. The parents have raised the children for this. It's not that they don't want them to do it, but something is ending, and we need to be together for each other. We need to be there for the family to give them a sense of comfort. We need to be there for the youngsters as they're starting out. Most of these rites of passage have all kinds of nuances. But my point was that the father was saying something very, very positive when he said, take care of my beloved daughter. And here, lo and behold, a godfather has taken those same two words and turned them into something 180 degrees different. If you ever hear a godfather saying those words with your name on the end of it, watch out. I mean, you are not about to get unconditional positive regard. Believe me, you are about to get something very, very different. The point I'm trying to make is that words change. They have a life of their own. Therefore, I've got to ask you, if you're going to see into the truth of what Jesus is talking about, we've got to unlearn, we've got to relearn, we've got to set aside deliberately of what the word meek has come to mean in our popular usage, and we've got to go back and ask, what was it that Jesus was talking about when, many centuries ago, he said one of the secrets of happiness is coming into the possession of this quality of meekness. This is what will enable you to inherit all of the joys of this earth and all the joys of happiness. In the Hebrew language, this word that has become much maligned in our own usage, in the Hebrew language, the word meant literally to be shaped or to be molded. A meek person was one who had something that understood its essence, something that understood its uniqueness, to take it and to shape it and form it into something exquisite and beautiful. What a potter did with a piece of clay, that is, feeling the texture, sensing what that clay was capable of becoming, and then through great patient effort shaping it into that true identity. That would be a symbol of the process of meekness being achieved. Or what a sculptor does when he takes an unformed piece of stone and, sensing in the grains of the rock what is possible and what is impossible, begins then to take away the things that don't pertain to its finest identity, and finally there emerges, sculpt out of that, something that is truly beautiful. So the first meaning of meekness is it's the process of having one's highest and best identity shaped and molded and sculpted and formed. You may have heard the story about the sculptor who was commissioned to do a bust of Abraham Lincoln, and he worked very carefully, patiently, day by day. There was a lady that cleaned up each night. She would sweep away the chips, and she couldn't help but watch the progress of this process. And as it was about to come to conclusion and the finishing touches were about to be added, she stayed over, because she did her work at night, until the sculptor came in the next morning, and she complimented him on this beautiful work that he had brought about. And then she asked the very simple question, how did you know Mr. Lincoln was in that rock? How did you sense that in what looked like it had no shape, that there was in fact that kind of identity? Being tamed or being molded and shaped is in a sense the process by which our true and best identity is identified, liberated, and brought to the surface. The later Greek language has a concept that is akin to this, but is a little different. In fact, it's not talking about so much working on the inanimate as it is working on the living and the biological. The Greek term for meekness meant essentially to be tamed or to be domesticated. Now here was the process of taking all kinds of wild urges and wild passions and so rechanneling them away from destruction into creativity so that the worst is weeded away and those energies are transmuted, sublimated, rechanneled so that they become the agents of something creative and something blessing. The Greek image that Plato made famous of a charioteer who had the reins on 4 steeds was his way of saying that the steeds are the passions, the emotions that make up the human condition, and the will and the reason are those guiding, taming, controlling, shaping kind of forces. It's the power that is able to control power. It is the ability to take brute and blind kind of forces that, if let run wild, can often be destructive, and learning how to transmute those into things that are creative. And today we have in our culture a beautiful example of what the Greek word to become meek is all about, in that all of these dogs that make up so much a part of our community. I understand you had St. Francis' blessing of the animals a Sunday afternoon. Ann and I were up at Swanee, University of the South, for graduation, and there's a great tradition there on the mountain that dogs are an affectionate part of that community. They run in and out of class. They go in and out of the students' dorms. One even walked in the chapel right in front of me as I was processing in the baccalaureate procession, and nobody seemed to be upset. The dogs were as much a part of that community as everything else. Do you realize that dogs are part of the wolf family? That is the part of the animal kingdom that they come from. But dogs are wolves that have had their destructive, wild tendencies domesticated out, and those energies have been transmuted into something that is very pleasing. I mean, from man's worst enemy to man's best friend, you're talking about the process of meekness. You're talking about what Jesus had in mind when he said that one of the secrets of happiness is to take all of these raging impulses, all of these raging emotions that make up the human condition, and finding a way, like Plato's charioteer, to bring all of those impulses under some kind of creative control. It is a focusing of the energies that make up our bodies and our being, so that they bless like the companionable dog, rather than destroy like the ravenous wolf. The difference between a wolf and a beloved dog is this process that Jesus meant by the term meek. Therefore, if I had to give some kind of definition of what I think Jesus was getting at, he was talking about that process where our true identity, that thing that we are at our highest and our best, it's the process by which that becomes the center of our being, and that the things that we do with our power are controlled out of our highest and best identity, rather than out of any other aspect of our being. So the meek person is the one who has come home to his or her highness, his or her best self, and then out of that one begins to do business with life. A couple of weeks ago I suggested that maybe we could understand poverty of spirit better if I contrasted it with its true opposites. Let me use that same procedure now. and suggest to you that maybe you can understand what Jesus meant by meekness if I contrast it with two kinds of behaviors that represent the opposite of the truly molded, the truly sculpted, the truly tamed individual. For example, meekness is at the other end of the continuum from impulsiveness. Impulsiveness I take to mean behavior that originates in some dark aspect of the psyche, some emotion or some feeling that wells up from God knows where, that it comes out of that destructive potentiality that is a part of all of our makeup. What every human being has ever done, each of us are capable of doing. The murderous rage, the impulse to hurt and destroy. We don't like to think about it, we don't like to admit, but part of the instinctive and emotional underground that makes up all of our lives contains these potentialities to use power in destructive ways. Now, the meek person is the person whose behavior does not originate and is not controlled by any and every impulse that passes through our psyche. I was in New York this summer and just happened to see a little piece in the New York Times on one of the back pages where a lady had been standing on a subway station platform. And as one of the express subways was coming through, a man had, at the last moment, pushed her directly into the path of this speeding thing. She, of course, was terribly mangled. Several people witnessed this act. This person was immediately apprehended. It turned out he did not know her. He didn't have any particular axe to grind against her. All he could say was that in that moment he simply had the urge to push her in front of the train. Now, where did that come from? What kind of aberrant behavior do we say this man was obviously, destined for some kind of mental ward? That impulse to do something destructive simply came out of somewhere. What kind of abused childhood, what kind of cruelty, who can say, but that's behavior that would be characterized as great impulsiveness. I think it's important for me to say that we really need to own and acknowledge and be very honest within ourselves about everything that we feel. It is a great danger for you to be so ashamed of certain impulses that you act like they don't exist. It's very important because we cannot control what we do not acknowledge. If we're not willing to admit that something exists, then that has a way of going underground, unconscious, and it can erupt on us. So I want to be clear in saying that the words should and ought are never appropriate for feelings and emotions. They are a lot like toothaches. If you had a toothache, and I begin to moralize with you and say, well, you ought not to have that. You shouldn't have it. That's ridiculous. If you've got it, you've got it. The place for shoulds and oughts is at the point of behavior. You and I need to acknowledge to ourselves everything that we feel impulsively. We do not have to act on everything that comes up from our emotional depths. We do have the charioteer that has the power to do something about these steeds that have all of this brute force. So what I'm suggesting is that we really do need to be honest about all of the things we feel. In other words, if you're on a high building and walk close to the edge, and from somewhere there comes this irrational urge to jump over, which I have experienced. You don't have to act on that. You may want to back away very quickly, but to acknowledge that there is some kind of self-destructive mystery that has blown for a moment through your psyche. I think it's important that we be honest about all that we feel, knowing that we have something else in us that is capable of controlling and rechanneling those impulses. I'm not inviting you to a massive suppression of the dark and shadow sides of self. I'm inviting you to be honest, but I'm saying that there is something else, and meekness is the preeminent example of having arrived at a kind of sense of self, a kind of identity out of which you can say yes and no to these different impulses, and you can be a part of channeling those impulses away from wolf-like behavior and into the kind of man's best friend that makes the most of the worst kinds of impulses. Martin Luther had a very wise saying that has been widely quoted, and that is, he said, "I can't keep the birds from flying over my head, but I can keep them from building a nest in my hair." And what that means is that I cannot control all of the feelings, all of the thoughts, all of the emotions that come through from wherever they come from. It may be what you had for breakfast, maybe how you slept last night. Who is to say the origin of these? I cannot keep the birds from flying over my head. I can keep them from concentrating, building a nest in my hair, and then crystallizing into some kind of behavioral pattern. The genuinely meek person is the person who has learned enough about their true identity. They have found the Mr. Lincoln in the rock so that they have something with which to do business with all of these different kinds of impulses that are simply part of our human condition. The other thing that I would put at the other end of the spectrum from true meekness is what I call reactionary behavior. Impulsive behavior starts from somewhere within. Reactionary behavior is triggered by what somebody out there does to you, and therefore your behavior is a reaction to it. The meek person has an identity, which means that he or she does not have to always respond to another on that other's terms, that we have the power to have some kind of choice as to what we're going to answer back when people do things to us. Now, I think one of our most subtle temptations, at least I would have to say it's a subtle temptation for me, is that when people treat me harshly and unjustly, when they injure me in some way, one of the subtlest temptations that I have is to imitate the very thing that I abhor in the name of righteous indignation. A person comes up and slaps you for no reason at all on the cheek. It has no rhyme or reason to it. It's just a sheer assertion of hurtful force. One's first impulse is to say, you need to know how it feels to be treated that way. You need a dose of your own medicine. You need to know the pain that you have just caused me, and so a reactive behavior is to hit that person back just as they have hit you. Now the trouble with that is that your blow has now given the person a new reason for hitting you a second time, and his second blow has given you a new reason for hitting him a second time, and that's where the war dance of destruction starts. When a person provokes us unjustly and we are seduced into imitating the very kind of behavior that we abhor, that is, we are pulled down to the level of whatever it is that is being done to us unjustly. Reactive behavior, as a rule, simply increases the problem. Almost never does it lead to some kind of creative solution. I had a friend back in the Baptist seminary who had served in the Army in World War II. He told me one day that he had happened to be in the particular American company that had liberated one of these terrible prisoner of war camps that the Germans had used to exterminate so many of the Jewish people. He said that they'd heard some rumors a few days ahead of the atrocities that had happened at this particular place, but he said nothing that they had heard could prepare them for the kind of horror that they experienced when they moved into the camp and there were only about 50 Germans left. The rest had fled. And they quickly surrendered and didn't put up any kind of fight. But he said as they saw the crematoriums, as they saw the stacks of bones, as they saw the teeth, as they saw the jewelry, all of those things that we have become familiar with in Holocaust history, he said they were absolutely overwhelmed by the incredible crime against humanity that had happened right there before their eyes. He said that the 50 Germans that had been captured were to be taken back to a train station where they were to be shipped to a prisoner of war camp. And he said about 10 of his American compatriots were given the responsibility of marching these prisoners of war back and getting them on the train. And he said they disappeared out of sight into a woods. And very shortly they heard several rapid fires of machine guns. And in a few minutes the 10 Americans came back with a sheepish look on their face, and they said we had no choice. They tried to escape, and so we had to kill them. And my friend said he knew full well, because how docile those Germans had been, that they had not tried to escape. He said the tragedy was that the inhumanity of that camp had caused the Americans to imitate the very kinds of injustice that they had abhorred. Their indignation against what the Germans had done had seduced them into doing the same kind of thing. Now, I don't know about you, but the subtlest temptation I have when I'm treated unjustly is, before I know it, I have begun to compete with that person on the very same terms that they are competing with me. And whenever we do that, we are not reacting out of that best identity that is in us. We're letting somebody else call the shots. We're letting somebody else set the tone. You've heard me say before that I think this Quaker aphorism is so powerfully true. If, in order to defeat the beast, one has to become a beast, it is bestiality that is won. If I have to become like an animal in order to defeat animal-like behavior, then all of us have gotten caught up in animality. So, it seems to me that you can understand meekness as that shaped, sculpted, molded, tamed kind of allowing our identity to control our behavior. You can understand it if you contrast it with the behavior that simply grows unchecked out of dark and destructive emotions, or behavior that originates in what somebody else does to you and you simply respond and do it back. Now, how does the process of meekness, being made meek, how does this happen? I thought maybe it might be helpful if I would point to two people in Holy Scripture about whom the word meek is used as a descriptive modifier. And let's look for a moment at their process, how they became to be what they are. And maybe that, along with the contrast, can help you see why Jesus felt the quality of meekness is so essential. In the book of Numbers, Moses, the great liberator, is described as the meekest man who ever lived upon this earth. Obviously, if you take that seriously, meekness cannot be equated with weakness. There was nothing weak about Moses. Why was it said that Moses could be described as a meek, tamed, sculpted, molded person? Well, if you know much about his story, you know that Moses was born to Hebrew parents at a time in Egypt when the Pharaoh was very, very uneasy about the growing population of Jews. He'd put out a dictum that every Hebrew male child was to be killed at birth because he didn't want them to continue to grow. But Moses' parents were clever. That it was an early act of civil disobedience. They managed to get him born and get him hidden before anybody found out about him. And you recall that when he was still an infant and they were hiding him in a little bamboo kind of enclosure floating on the banks of the Nile River, that one day the Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe and the baby cried inadvertently. And she sent her maids over, and there she found the Hebrew baby. And it could have been the end of Moses' life, except that somehow the Pharaoh's daughter was greatly attracted to this little minority child. And so instead of having him killed, as her father had said, she decided on the spot to adopt this child and allow this child to be hers and grow up in the royal palace. And so that's how Moses managed to survive in those earliest days. He got to go through all of the school for royalty that was prepared for the Pharaoh's family. He had a place of real prestige. And so when he got to be a young man, he faced a very crucial decision. Do I forget all about the way that I came into history and just simply accept this privilege and go on and enjoy myself? Or do I remember that I come from a slave people who are still languishing in slavery, and do I do anything for them? Someone has said that there are finally just two kinds of people. There are people who want to make the world a better place for everybody, and there are people who are content for a better place for themselves. Yes. If Moses had been this latter kind, then he would have taken a very different life course. He was concerned to make the world a better place for everybody. He couldn't forget his Hebrew beginnings. And so as a young man with a royal education, he began to try to do something to liberate his kinsfolk. His first act was an act of impulse. He saw an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew one day, and it made him so mad that he killed that Egyptian with his own bare hands. It was an impulsive act. It was a reactionary act. It was not an act of meekness. And I don't know what Moses expected. Maybe he thought that would trigger the revolution, but it didn't. The Hebrews didn't know him, didn't trust him. The Egyptians became suspicious. And so he who had had such great idealistic hopes of what he could do for his people has to flee for his life and go over and become a shepherd in the Midian deserts. It looked for all practical purposes as if Moses' effective life had been ended. For 40 years, he walked those silent, trackless wastes, tending sheep, being by himself. And what he did not know was that God was preparing him for a task that he never dreamed he would have to do. Those trackless wastes of Midian were precisely the stretch of land that he was going to have to lead the people of Israel across when he finally got them out of Egypt. And he needed to know that terrain like the back of his hand, the way a shepherd would be able to learn it. Let me pause and say that God is often preparing us for things that he has yet for us to do that don't seem to have any connection with what is happening at this moment. I want to contend that there is a great mercy in our not knowing the whole future. If we knew everything that the days ahead hold, the weight of that would crush today. If I had known back in 1959, the night my little girl was born, if I had known that night that she was only going to live 10 years and have 3 significant episodes of illness and was going to suffer as she did for the last 5 months of her life, if I had known from the beginning the way her whole future was going to emerge, I could not have enjoyed those 10 years. I would have been crushed by knowing too much. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. So there is a mercy that we don't know the future, but that does not mean that we should mistrust the future. God may be preparing you to do something out ahead through the things you're having to suffer at this moment, and you don't even realize the connection. Moses did not have an inkling that he was one day going to need to know that terrain. But God, in his ingenious mercy, was preparing Moses for a task that he yet had to give him. The other thing that happened out there in the desert was that Moses really was stripped down in the silence of that experience to looking at himself, at his limits, at his gifts. He must have asked 1,000,000 times in those long, lonely days, God, what did you have in mind when you birthed me? What was it that you put me into this body to do? What are my gifts? What are my limits? Who am I, and what did you call me into history to perform? And what I'm suggesting is that through those long desert years, Moses came home to that identity, which was the very essence of his being. He had found out in Egypt what he couldn't do. He found out when God called him after 40 years that he did have the gifts of leadership. And by the time that Moses went back to face the Pharaoh, he was genuinely meek. He had been tamed. He had been molded. He had been shaped. He knew who he was, where he began, and where he left off. And that's the secret of why he was able, in those long years of having to patiently work with the troublesome children of Israel. These people who had not known freedom for 400 years were suddenly set free, and not surprisingly, they went wild. They didn't know what to do with freedom. They made every kind of abuse of it that you can imagine. It was frustrating beyond measure. A couple of Sundays ago, the Old Testament lesson had the Hebrews bitching to high heaven about we don't have celery, we don't have onions, we don't have this, we don't have that out in the desert. And Moses is saying, I've about had it up to here with these people. I got them out, and now what do I get for it? Here they are complaining about the menu that is now being served in this free place. It was not easy to do what Moses did, but he had been made meek. He had learned to respond out of his identity, not out of his impulses, and not out of reacting to these people who were so difficult. That's why the Bible says that Moses was the meekest of men, and it is a process by which identity is identified, and it becomes the controlling center of one's behavior. Jesus himself says, when he's talking about, take my yoke upon you, I am meek and lowly of heart. Now, again, you have a perfect image of what our Lord meant by the quality of meekness. It is not to be interpreted as weakness. Jesus, in his own way, did the same thing that had happened to Moses. That is, after he was baptized and began to feel himself given the task of Messiah, the first thing he did was to go into the wilderness, and for 40 days he lived with the question, what does it mean to be Jesus? What does it mean to be who I am in this time, in this place? He faced the temptations to use his power in a lot of destructive and a lot of deviant ways. He finally was able to identify that complete sense of the high self. And he came out of his temptations to act intentionally, to be proactive instead of reactive. If you follow Jesus, it is very clear that his behavior grew out of what he was and not out of dark impulses. It wasn't triggered by other people. You remember the time that Mary and Martha said, come quick, our brother Lazarus is about to die. And Jesus had other things that he had to do, so by the time he got there, Lazarus had died, and Martha goes out and upbraids him and says, if you had been here like we had asked you to do, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus very coolly says, it was not mine to do. On another occasion he said, nobody takes my life out of my hands. I lay it down, I pick it up. My behavior comes out of my identity. It doesn't originate anywhere else. And the place you see the meekness of Jesus come to its highest expression is there at the end when he has been so incredibly abused and mistreated. And he's hanging on the cross, and they're making fun of him. They have spit on him. They have tortured him. They have now got him nailed up, hands and feet. They have treated him worse than you would treat a dog. And Jesus, in the face of all that inhumanity, managed to remain humane. He did not, in order to defeat the beast, become a beast. Being treated like a dog, he continued to react like a human being. Now that is genuine meekness. In the epistle of 1 Peter, Simon Peter is reflecting back on the awesomeness of what he saw in Jesus. And with a kind of hush in his voice, he said, when reviled, he did not revile in return. When condemned, he did not condemn. Peter remembered that a slave girl, by fire, had so frightened him, Simon, that he had begun to curse and fill the air with the words, I don't know him, I've never heard of him. Peter was the classic, having been reviled, he began to revile back. The classic of reactive behavior. But then later he went and watched Jesus undergo even more inhumane treatment, and Jesus stayed humane in the face of inhumanity. And that is the essence of meekness. Okay, it's a process by which we identify the highest and best that we are, and begin to act out of that. It seems like to me in conclusion that the key to this quality, the essence of how meekness begins to happen to us, is found in the verb that you find in this beatitude: blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meekness is not something you have to earn. It is not something that you squeeze out of yourself by willpower. Meekness is an inheritance. If you'll stop and think about it, the things we inherit are the things that come to us by virtue of who we're kin to, not by virtue of what we've done. Inheritances are given to us. They are not something that we deserve. And meekness, inheriting the kingdom, is when you and I let every influence that we possibly can show us who it is that we really are. I think of Jesus receiving his life from the Father as a gift, and then giving those gifts back to the Father and saying, how do you want me to use them? How do you want me to take these things that you have given so that they will serve your highest purpose? And that wonderful picture of the Father giving everything to the Son, and the Son giving everything back to the Father, and the Father giving it back to him in wisdom, that is the process that every one of us are capable of doing. If you want to find your way to meekness, again and again ask God, what did you have in mind when you created me? What did you want me to be when you called me out of nothing? And as the identity of what God had in mind for you begins to take shape, let that control your impulses. Let it control your reactions to what other people do. As you've heard me say many times before, there is a givenness to life. Life is gift. That means that you don't determine how tall you're going to be. You don't determine the color of your eyes. There is a givenness to life that is here because of what has been done for you through inheritance. Accepting that and then asking God what he wants you to do with it is the way to be shaped. It's the way to be molded. It's the way to be tamed. Sin is always an identity issue. It's the refusal to be what God had in mind when he created you. You can do it by being arrogant and trying to be more than you are. You can do it by being apathetic and being less than you are. Anytime you find yourself being envious of another person, know that that means you have never come home to the gift of yourself. If you could know the grand and good thing that has been given to you, then you could celebrate other people's gifts. If I'm envious, it means I don't realize the good thing I already am, that I have in me. There is a Lincoln in every one of our rocks, and coming home to that is at the heart of what I think meekness is about. I have a friend named Winnie Pierce who grew up in a little town in North Carolina. Her high school drama teacher let her know that she sensed that there was potential in her, even though she came from a very simple family. That teacher was instrumental in getting her to go on scholarship to a state university in North Carolina. Her theatrical gifts blossomed. She did so well that she was given a scholarship to the University of Chicago to work on a master's in drama. She got there, and in about November of that year, they announced that Thornton Wilder had been commissioned to do an original play for that particular department. They had the tryouts, and Winnie Pierce from Andrews, North Carolina, won the lead role. In fact, it was hers to live out one of the chief characters in Thornton Wilder's original play. They were in production for several months. The performance was given in late April. She had worked very, very hard to do her best. She gave the performance. There was a tremendous applause at the end of it. She had that exhilaration that comes when you feel like that what you've done has been affirmed. And then I heard her say that she went back to her room and it was quiet, and something of the wonder of the experience was still lingering when there was a knock on the door. And she opened it, and there stood a man she had never met before. He was humble, he was quiet. He asked if he could come in, and he identified himself as Thornton Wilder. And then he said to Winnie, "Tonight, you made a dream of mine come true. I want you to know that what you created on that stage is exactly what I had in mind when I first conceived of this character. I want to thank you for bringing to fruition what I had always dreamed." Now that is what it means to be meek. And wouldn't it be great when we have at last given our performance, when our time on the stage has come to an end, whether there's been applause or whether there hasn't been anything at all, wouldn't it be great to go back to that place where we go in the silence of the grave and have the Creator himself knock on the door and say, "I want to thank you, because the thing that I had in mind when I first thought of you is exactly what you managed to embody." Now that is one of the secrets of joy. It's one of the secrets of being happy. To ask of the great giver, what did you have in mind? And then let that become the identity out of which we act, out of which we give to the world. Blessed are the meek, if they're understood in that kind of way. And every one of us can be that. Amen. Would you let the choir make their way to the choir?